The car that talked back drove itself and made a generation of kids convinced that their family's Buick could do the same if you just said the right thing to it. One black Pontiac Trans Am, a red scanner bar, and a voice that somehow made David Hasselhoff seem like the less interesting half of the duo. This is the story of what really happened to KITT after the cameras stopped rolling, where the cars went, which ones survived, which ones didn't, and why the answer is more complicated and more heartbreaking than any fan of the show wants to hear. Hi, my name is Johnny, and this is American Muscle, the car behind the legend, what KITT actually was. The Knight Industries 2000 Series was, underneath all the gadgetry and the William Daniels voice work, a 1982 Pontiac Firebird Trans Am, second generation F-body platform, the same one that had been in production since 1970. By the time Knight Rider premiered on NBC on September 26, 1982, the Trans Am had already spent a decade building its reputation as the definitive American performance car of its era. Smokey and the Bandit had put the car on a cultural pedestal in 1977. Pontiac moved over 117,000 of them that year alone. The 1982 Trans Am came with a 5.0-liter V8, a turbo-hydromatic 400 automatic transmission, and somewhere between 145 and 160 horsepower. It was fast enough to feel exciting, smooth enough to look effortless, and wide enough to fill a television screen with pure attitude. The production team knew exactly what they were doing when they picked it. What the show's builders did to that platform was a different conversation entirely. The external modifications are what everyone remembers. The red LED scanner bar mounted across the front fascia, sweeping left to right in that distinctive rhythm that became one of the most recognizable sound effects in television history. The custom front bumper with the integrated fog lights, the blacked out hood with the functional louvers, the deep tint on every piece of glass, the removal of virtually all exterior chrome, replaced with black trim that gave the car a sinister, almost weaponized look, and the KITT badge replacing the Trans Am bird on the hood, which, by the way, was a decision that infuriated exactly 0 Pontiac executives because the free publicity was worth considerably more than any logo placement fee. The interior was its own project. The dashboard was gutted and replaced with a custom instrument panel built around the show's fictional computer interface. The steering wheel was replaced, a center console voice modulator was installed, the physical prop that Michael Knight spoke to, and that the production used as a visual anchor for the idea that the car was communicating back. None of it was real, obviously. The car did not have artificial intelligence. So it did not talk, it did not drive itself. I know, some of you needed that confirmed out loud and I respect it. What it did have was one of the most effective illusions in television design history, a car that looked so specifically, so deliberately built for a single purpose that audiences accepted the premise on sight. You didn't question whether a car that looked like that could be a supercomputer. Of course it could. How many KITs were there? Here's the question that every serious Knight Rider fan eventually arrives at. And the answer is the one that starts to complicate the mythology. There was not one KIT. There was never one KIT. There was a fleet of them, built and rebuilt over the course of 4 seasons. And the exact number depends on how you count and who you ask. The show ran from 1982 through 1986. Keeping a single car functional and screen ready for that kind of production schedule was not realistic. This wasn't a film with a 6-week shoot. This was a weekly television series with a car that was on screen in almost every single scene of every single episode. The mechanical demands alone would have destroyed one car inside of a single season, never mind what the stunt work did to them. The production maintained what industry people call a hero car for each season, the primary vehicle used for close-ups, interior scenes, Hasselhoff interactions, anything the camera needed to do up close and intimate with the machine. These were kept in the best possible condition because they were the cars the audience was actually looking at. Every detail mattered on the hero cars. The scanner bar had to work perfectly. The interior had to be consistent. The finish had to hold up under harsh lighting conditions. Alongside the hero car, the production ran a rotation of stunt cars. These were built to the same exterior specification. Same black paint, same scanner bar, same front fascia. but their interiors and mechanicals were configured for durability and replacement rather than beauty. They took the jumps, they took the chases, they took the sequences that ended with a car hitting something at speed, and the director calling cut, and the stunt coordinator walking over to assess the damage. Across the full run of the series, most estimates from production veterans and documented sources place the total number of Trans Ams used in Knight Rider at somewhere between 17 and over 30 vehicles, depending on whether you include partial builds, cars used for static display and promotional purposes, and the cars built for the 1983 and 1985 television movies. The most commonly cited figure for fully built screen-used cars is around 17. I want to be honest with you about something though. The actual number is one of those questions that production records from that era answer imprecisely, because studios in the early 1980s were not keeping detailed logs with future collector markets in mind. They were making television. The paperwork reflects that. The builders responsible for the KITT cars worked primarily out of the Universal Studios workshop, supplemented by outside contractors for specific modifications. The scanner bar electronics were handled separately from the body modifications. The interior conversion was its own project. This was not one person in one shop over 2 weeks, the way Eddie Paul put together the Cobra Mercuries. This was an ongoing industrial operation that lasted 4 years and chewed through Trans Ams the way a film crew chews through coffee, on set and on the road. Life during production. 4 seasons of weekly television means 4 seasons of weekly destruction. Simple math with brutal consequences. The stunt work on Knight Rider was genuinely extreme for a network show in that era. Not movie extreme, not big budget extreme. Network television extreme, which meant pulling off sequences that would have been ambitious on a feature film budget, except they had to do it every single week with the same car, the same crew, and a production schedule that did not care about your feelings or your Trans Am. KITT jumped things. KITT launched off ramps. KITT hit other vehicles, scraped through gaps, and drove at speeds the production deliberately pushed to the edge of what was manageable. The show's entire premise was built on the idea that this car was invincible. Selling that premise on screen meant the stunt cars had to absorb punishment that tested the actual structural limits of 1982 Pontiac engineering. There was no other way to make it convincing. The turbo boost jumps deserve their own moment here, because people forget how physically real those sequences were. When KITT launches over an obstacle, that is not a camera trick. That is a real ramp, a real car, and a real launch at real speed. A Trans Am weighs roughly 3,500 pounds. Getting 3,500 pounds of American muscle properly airborne and landing it without killing anyone or destroying the one car you need for close-ups tomorrow morning required a level of preparation and coordination that the stunt team executed week in and week out for 4 straight seasons. They destroyed cars doing it. That was the assumption going in. The stunt cars were built to be sacrificed, and they were sacrificed on schedule. Season 1 was the most punishing. The production was still calibrating the balance between protecting the hero car and getting the footage the scripts demanded. There was learning happening in real time, and the cars absorbed the cost of that learning. By Season 2, the separation was cleaner. A firmer line between what the hero car touched and what got handed to the stunt rotation. By Seasons 3 and 4, the whole operation had settled into something resembling a system. Cars came in, got prepped, served their specific purpose, took their damage, went back to the shop where possible, and eventually got retired when the repair math stopped making sense. What that looks like on the other end, when the show wrapped in 1986, is a fleet in wildly different states of survival. Some cars were in reasonable condition. Some were structural casualties wearing a fresh coat of black paint to disguise how badly they had been used. And some were simply gone. Not sold, not stored, not parked somewhere waiting to be rediscovered in a barn 40 years later. Just gone, used up completely in service of making a television car look immortal. The irony there writes itself. When the show ended, NBC cancels Knight Rider after 4 seasons. The show ends. The KITT fleet, whatever remained of it, now belonged to Universal, and Universal had to decide what to do with a collection of heavily modified Trans Ams that had no immediate commercial use. If you've watched any of the other episodes on this channel, you already know what comes next. Because this is where the story always goes, and it never stops being frustrating. The surviving cars were dispersed. Some went to the Universal Studios tour operation, where KITT appearances had become a significant audience draw. Universal recognized early that KITT was one of those fictional vehicles that had crossed the line into genuine cultural icon status. People didn't just like the show, they wanted to be physically near the car, and the tour operation was a logical place to deploy a hero-quality vehicle for exactly that purpose. The rest, sold, donated, written off, fine? Sent back into the world the way fleet vehicles always get sent back into the world, which is to say, without ceremony, without documentation, and without anyone stopping to flag the fact that these were the actual cars from one of the most watched television shows of the 1980s. This was completely standard practice for Universal in that era. The studio did the same thing with cars from shows that hadn't become cultural phenomena, so doing it to KITT wasn't even a conscious decision to discard something important. It was just the default. The pipeline moved and the cars moved with it. Some were purchased by Pontiac dealerships for promotional display. Think about that for a second. Cars that had been jumping ramps on a Universal Studios production lot ended up in the showrooms of Pontiac dealers in the Midwest, sitting next to actual cars for sale, wearing price tags they were never meant to wear. Eventually those cars moved too. Some went to private buyers, some sat, some got stripped. The documentation that would have allowed anyone to trace those cars definitively, production records, VIN logs, chain of ownership paperwork, either was never created in the first place or was scattered with the same casual indifference that characterized the whole dispersal. This is the brutal, grinding reality of automotive preservation history that I keep coming back to on this show. Nobody was thinking about what these cars would mean in 2026. They were thinking about clearing the lot, tracking the survivors. Where the KITs ended up here is where it gets complicated in a way that I want to be genuinely transparent about, because this is one of those stories where the honest answer is less satisfying than the version people want to hear. The replica problem hit Knight Rider harder than almost any other production vehicle in television history. The KIT conversion was achievable. That's the thing. A 1982 Pontiac Trans Am was not a rare or expensive car in the late 1980s. Thousands of this were sitting on used car lots. The scanner bar electronics were replicable, the front fascia modifications were replicable, the interior conversion was replicable. And an entire community of dedicated fans, many of whom were also talented fabricators and car builders, set about replicating KIT with a level of commitment and skill that produced results that were, in many cases, visually indistinguishable from the real production cars. By the mid-1990s, there were hundreds of KIT replicas in circulation. By the 2000s, estimates from people who study this market put the number in the thousands worldwide. And here is the authentication nightmare that creates. When a car surfaces claiming to be a production-used KIT, proving it is genuine requires a documentation chain that very few of these cars actually have. A VIN that traces to Universal's production fleet. Paper records from the period, photographic evidence connecting a specific car to specific scenes, the kind of provenance that is genuinely hard to establish for vehicles that left Universal's possession in the manner they did. Several cars have surfaced over the years with varying levels of credibility. One car was displayed for years at Universal Studios Florida and is documented as having been used during the production period, though its specific role, hero car, stunt car, promotional vehicle, has been a matter of ongoing discussion among researchers. A car appeared at a Universal Studios Hollywood display that was presented to visitors as the original KIT, though the production history of that specific vehicle is complicated by the fact that Universal refreshed and replaced the display car at various points during the 1980s and 90s, meaning the car on display in 1988 was not necessarily the same car on display in 1994. There is a car in the collection of the National Corvette Museum in Bowling Green, Kentucky. And yes, I know, a Trans Am in a Corvette museum, only in America, that has documentation connecting it to the Knight Rider production. It sits in what I describe as a respectable but not definitive position in the provenance conversation. Documented, credible, not beyond challenge. The most persistently discussed candidate for the best surviving hero car is a vehicle that has changed hands multiple times since production, whose ownership chain has been partially, but not fully reconstructed, and whose documentation is strong enough to be taken seriously by people who study this carefully. I'm going to be straight with you. This is not a clean story with a clean ending. This is a story where the trail gets muddy and stays muddy, and anyone who tells you otherwise is either working from incomplete information or selling something. The replica epidemic and why it matters. Let me take a minute here and explain why the replica problem is more than just an inconvenience for collectors, because I think most people who aren't deep in this world underestimate what's actually at stake. When a production car is properly authenticated, it carries the physical history of everything that happened to it. This isn't a sentimental point, it's a forensic one. The paint has the right layer history: base coat, production modifications, touch-ups done on set between shooting days. The frame has stress in the right places, stress that tells you exactly what kind of work this car was asked to do. The interior has wear patterns that are consistent with actual use by actual human beings on an actual production. The bolts have been turned. The carpet has been compressed. The dashboard has fingerprints baked into its history that no replica can replicate, because no replica was ever there. These things matter not just for commercial value, though the commercial value is real and significant. They matter because a genuine production KIT is a primary source document. It tells you how this show was actually made, what the real car looked like under studio lighting versus how it reads on a 1982 television set, how the modifications were executed in practice versus how they were described in production notes, what corners got cut on a weekly television budget and what didn't. You cannot get that information from a replica. A replica is a copy of the surface. The real car is the surface and everything underneath it. Here is where the KITT situation becomes its own specific kind of painful, and I want to draw a comparison that makes the problem concrete. The Cobra Mercury from the Stallone film, the Dirty Mary Charger, the Training Day Monte Carlo. All of those cars had unusual enough specifications that building a convincing replica required serious money, serious fabrication skill, and access to parts that were not sitting in the average enthusiast's garage. A 1950 Mercury with a supercharged Chevy 350, a full roll cage, and flush-mounted fenced headlights is not something you throw together on a Saturday. A 1969 Charger RT 440 in citron yellow with documented production provenance is not something that exists in multiples by accident. A black 1982 Pontiac Trans Am with a red LED scanner bar and a custom front bumper, that is something people build in their garage on weekends for fun. And they have been doing exactly that since approximately 1983 with increasing skill and decreasing cost as the parts became more available and the community knowledge deepened. By the mid-1990s, there were hundreds of KITT replicas in circulation. By the 2000s, people tracking this market were estimating thousands worldwide. Thousands. Which means that when a genuine production car surfaces, it is entering a pool so crowded with faithful imitations that proving its identity requires documentation that most of these cars simply never had the opportunity to accumulate. The thing that made KITT universally beloved, the accessibility of the idea, the feeling that this was a car anyone could dream about owning, is the exact same thing that made the authentication problem effectively unsolvable. That is a cruel irony that I don't think the show's creators ever saw coming, and honestly, why would they? They were just trying to make good television. The one that survived, with its story. Of all the KITT cars whose fates are documented with any reliability, the one with the most coherent story is the car that went directly from Universal's production fleet into the Universal Studios tour operation and stayed within the Universal ecosystem long enough to accumulate the kind of institutional documentation that privately sold cars simply never had the opportunity to gather. That car was seen, photographed, documented, and referenced across enough official Universal materials from the 1980s and early 90s that its production origins are not seriously disputed. It exists. It is in private hands now, having left the Universal tour operation at some point in the past 3 decades. And unlike the cars that went to dealerships or private buyers in 1986 with no paperwork and no story attached, this one came with receipts. Is it the hero car from season 1? Is it the car Hasselhoff actually drove? Those are questions the documentation doesn't answer with total certainty. What it answers is simpler and more important. This car was built for the production, used during the production period, and has a chain of custody that doesn't disappear into a used car lot somewhere in 1987. In a field full of cars whose stories have gaps you could drive a Trans Am through, that is worth something. What KITT really meant. Here's what I keep coming back to, and it's the thing that separates KITT from almost every other television car in history. KITT was not just a car, it was a character. It had a name, it had a personality, it had dialogue, it had an arc. David Hasselhoff's Michael Knight was the human lead, but the show's emotional center, the thing audiences were actually attached to, was the relationship between a man and a machine that could talk back. In 1982, America, with personal computing just beginning to enter everyday life, and the idea of artificial intelligence still existing primarily in science fiction, Knight Rider was putting something on screen that felt genuinely futuristic without feeling frightening. KITT was friendly, KITT was loyal, KITT was, and I realize how this sounds, a good car. The 1982 Trans Am provided the physical foundation for that idea. But Eddie Murphy once said something about the difference between a star and a movie star. And I think about it every time I look at footage of KITT. The car didn't just look right, it felt right. The proportions, the stance, the way the scanner bar animated the front fascia into something that suggested a face. And all of it added up to a vehicle that projected personality without a single moving part doing anything that wasn't already in the Pontiac factory spec. Pontiac killed the Trans Am in 2002. The brand itself died in 2010. And now, a generation that grew up watching KITT jump things and outwit criminals is old enough to understand that the cars they loved as children are historical artifacts, and that the systems that created those cars treated them like consumables. Some of the KITT cars are gone, definitely, verifiably gone, used up in production and never rebuilt. Some are in states of partial survival, bodies without drivetrains, or drivetrains in cars that no longer look anything like they did on screen. A handful exist in documented, identifiable form, and several thousand replicas are driving around the world right now, each one a tribute built by someone who loved the car enough to spend serious money making it real in their own driveway. I don't know whether to find that beautiful or heartbreaking. Honestly, I think it's both.